Celeste Assist mode trivializes the core experience of the game in the name of accessibility. Now, I could just say that and move on to the how and why, but this is a bit of a delicate topic. It intersects with an exposed vein in the community, a splotchy purple sore spot that balloons up with pain and bad vibes whenever the word accessibility comes into the spotlight. And as such, it deserves a little framing, a little context, to keep all the ready-made anger and valid points of contention at bay. So let's start by talking a bit about accessibility. No one is really against accessibility. No one is really against helping people who lack the capacity or means of playing the game the ability to access experience. People with medical conditions that make the physical challenge of wrestling with the controls an arduous or impossible prospect. People who play a game like Celeste, who repeat a section again and again, knowing exactly what they need to do to proceed, who see the chain of mapped out action clear as anything in their heads, but try as they might are incapable of completing the set of required action. Allowing the sickly, the impaired, and the unable the means of accessing the game is fundamentally a beautiful, wonderful thing. So why the negativity? Why the bad vibes? Well, it's simple. Accessibility modes and options can be roughly divided into two camps: quality of life changes and difficulty changes. Quality of life changes cover a range of accessibility mode options that really don't drop that much ire, that really have only little to incidental effect on gameplay. Stuff like colorblind filter options, disabling screen shake, closed captioning, depth of field, lens flare, you know the ones. No one really has a problem with this stuff. Some of this inarguably affects gameplay. Colorblind modes can make screens more readable, closed captioning can provide warning where there might otherwise be none, and so on. But still, usually this kind of stuff is clearly quality of lifey, clearly incidental from what forms the core of the game. What people do have a problem with is the other side, where accessibility impacts difficulty directly. Stuff like aim assist in shooters, Mario Pity power-ups, and Sekiro game speed mods. That range of options that directly deals with the primary challenge of the game in the name of accessibility. Because where discussion tends to get most heated is where accessibility modes and easier difficulty intersect. And this should come as no surprise, because when you look at these specific kind of gameplay altering, non-quality of life accessibility options, when you examine what they functionally do, it is clear enough what they are. They're easy modes. They just so happen to be easy modes that mean different things depending on who makes use of them. And this is important, because when this kind of accessibility mode is ill-conceived, they become the worst kind of easy mode. All semblance of challenge is ripped away, and the core experience of the game is left fundamentally crippled. Accessibility becomes a way of simply avoiding the challenge presented by the game. And really, this is what is at the heart of the negativity surrounding accessibility. Simply put, it's a bit of a pride thing, all tied to the idea, the notion, that if there's a way for someone to make the game easier for themselves, it cheapens your own achievement. You took every test the game threw at you and overcame them, one after the other. You didn't take the game's handouts. You did it with skill and grit and bootstraps. But this is just a part of it. This alone is grumble and grousing tier. The greater pushback comes from a deeper place. There is a fear of the casualization of games, a fear of games being softened and trivialized in the name of inclusivity, a fear that core gamers, those players who relish difficulty and harder experiences, will find themselves surrounded by ever easier and more trivial games, until one day they look around in horror to find themselves locked away at the fringes, their enjoyment no longer accessible to them. Because if the idea that someone might use an accessibility mode to minimize your own achievement can be called a fear, then the idea that games in aggregate might start to be watered down in the name of accessibility is an outright terror. And all of that sounds really doom and gloom, which begs the question, why do we even have this kind of accessibility mode at all? Why not stick to the quality of life stuff that no one really has a problem with? Why mess around with gameplay, with difficulty? To answer this, let us finally turn directly to Celeste. Celeste is a game about overcoming a difficult obstacle. The player controls Madeline, a character who sets for herself a self-imposed challenge of climbing the mountain. A character who begins unsure if she is capable of accomplishing her task, but faces down and embraces her demons to eventually succeed. The game kind of says to both Madeline and a player, this is where you stand. This is you. You might not be happy with where you are. You might wish you were more capable or different, but you are you. Even the game's mechanics reflect this. Madeline can run, jump, dash, and climb. That's it. Her moveset remains almost entirely static the whole game. It is the circumstances and environment that changes around you. All you have is what you have. A core toolset of moves with which the player navigates and challenges everything the game can throw at you. Because there is an obstacle in front of you. No, more than that. There is a goal in front of you. A goal you set. It's up to you to show yourself you can do it. It is a wonderful message. But it's a message that only works if you succeed. If you get to the end. What does the experience say about those who don't make it? Who are physically unable? Who give up? Who actually fall short? What you get is a story about a girl who gives up, who never reaches the top of the mountain, who lets anxiety and her better demons win. It's a bit of a downer story, really. Which is interesting. Because this is a reason. This is why we have accessibility modes that deal directly with difficulty. This is why Celeste has an assist mode at all. Most media doesn't have to presuppose that a person might be unable to make it to the end of the experience. They don't have to include allowances in their theming and narrative for those who are not skilled or able enough to proceed. A movie doesn't pause mid-scene until you've satisfied its conditions. A book might demand interpretation and comprehension, but it does not bar you from turning its pages. But games do. Traditionally, games are about challenge. Challenge with fail states. Usually, binary fail states. Which means two options. You win or you lose, and you can only progress if you win. So what happens to a person incapable of meeting the requirements of the challenge? They simply cannot progress. They are locked out of the experience. Whether it be through a lack of requisite skill or physical limitations, the experience is rendered inaccessible. Which brings us back to the subject of today's video, Celeste and its assist mode. I want to be absolutely clear on this. This isn't about saying the assist mode is wrong. It isn't about saying it is bad to use the mode, because it isn't. There is real good these modes achieve, and there are compelling reasons for why they might be necessary even when they directly impact difficulty. But recognizing the need and good accessibility modes achieve does not mean we cannot be critical of their implementation, that we cannot use them as lessons on how to do better. Because what I am interested in is how the assist mode changes the game, the specific levers the game chooses to fiddle with, and how those choices shift Celeste into a fundamentally different kind of experience. An experience that is entirely opposed to the base game and its theming. For Celeste's central message about overcoming obstacles is wonderful, and it meshes perfectly with the mechanics of the game and the player's own experience challenging it. But it is also a message that is entirely undercut by having a mode that can at will entirely trivialize the challenge presented by the game. Because an unpalatable truth about Celeste's assist mode is that it doesn't just make Celeste into a different experience. It doesn't just make Celeste into an easier experience. It makes Celeste into a trivial experience. Trivial both because of what aspects assist mode chooses to affect, and by the very structure of Celeste itself. For Celeste assist mode does not deal in minor quality of life changes. It deals with the very core of the game. It directly impacts the gameplay, which means it directly impacts the difficulty. So, let's start there. Let's start with difficulty. Platformers are all about strawberries. You are here. The strawberry is there. And the name of the game is quite simple. A. Figure out how to get from here to there. And B. Do it. Sure, sometimes it's not a literal strawberry. Sometimes the strawberry is invisible. Sometimes it's just the end of the level, but the internal logic remains the same. Determine the steps and movement options required to reach the objective. Then, execute a string of input to reach said objective. A side and B side. Puzzle side and technical execution side. These are the fundamentals, and these are the vectors along which platformers deal with difficulty. Let's start with the puzzle side. Difficulty on the puzzle front generally revolves around presenting a wider variety of mechanics, systems, and noise that serve as obstacles to reaching your objective. Think of a particularly elusive strawberry, where half the challenge is figuring out how you're supposed to reach it in the first place. The player is the planner, and movement options are the player's toolset. The difficulty of the challenge comes from figuring out what combination of moves is necessary to reach your objective. It's all about figuring out how to avoid the spikes, when to jump, where to dash, and in what direction. Then there's the technical execution side. This is piano difficulty. Skill-based difficulty in the reflex hand-eye coordination sense. Difficulty on this front amounts to requiring more correct, exact inputs at a time, more quickly and with less room for error. It's about being as exacting in timing and performance as possible, about punishing errors and inching ever closer to a standard of perfection. Usually what difficulty on this front looks like is more instant death hazards like spikes and pits, smaller platforms, and ever longer stretches of gameplay with no respite or checkpoints. So that's the two sides, puzzle difficulty and technical execution difficulty. So now it becomes time to see what the assist mode actually changes. When you toggle the mode on and mosey your way over to the menu, you see options for game speed, infinite stamina, air dashes, and invincibility. In quick summary, the game speed percentage allows you to alter the clock of the game, so at 50% the game is half as fast as it would be in its base form. Infinite stamina allows you to climb and hold onto walls indefinitely. Invincibility makes instant death hazards like spikes and black clouds non-interactable, and replaces falling to your death with a cute little auto hop. And air dashes allows you to alter the amount of dashes you can perform before refreshing them with a crystal or landing on a platform. This one has two options, 2 dashes or infinite. If we think back to the two types of difficulty mentioned earlier, it's clear enough which side the assist mode directly targets. It's all about the technical execution side. All of these options are about the player character. They're all about the movement. And not to put too fine a point on it, they're all about making that part of the game easier. More flexible movement, more forgiving timings, and more leeway in the event of error. Game speed allows players more time to react and execute actions. Infinite stamina means a lower tolerance for error, no more time pressure when deciding when to make a crucial jump, and opening up routes for bypassing certain obstacles altogether. Though honestly, this one has very minor impact. Invincibility means no more instant death conditions, no more restarting the level. And the air dashes ranges from more freedom of movement and alternate routes on the lower end of the spectrum, to outright eliminating the need to ever worry about landing. So, what does this all achieve? The challenge inherent in timing and executing sequences of input is softened away to nothing, and the tolerance for error is widened or removed outright. The difficulty of the technical execution side of the game is left somewhere between trivial and a non-factor, and naturally, when technical difficulty is made less relevant, the game leans more heavily on the other side of its difficulty to carry the experience. So let's talk about that. The other side of the coin, the puzzle side of the difficulty. When we glance once more over the range of options, we see nothing that immediately looks like it affects puzzle difficulty. None of these options shift the layout of the maps themselves. Nothing about obstacles, about the environments, or even the hazards. The stages are left exactly as they were in the base game. It is only factors related to navigating the environment that are altered. It looks like the puzzle aspect of Celeste remains intact, unchanged from the basic experience. And that would be the case, were game speed the only option that the assist mode allowed players to change. But the other options, infinite stamina, air dashes, and invincibility, don't just make technical execution trivial, they make the puzzles trivial too. For the expanded range of movement changes the solutions of the puzzles presented by the game. And this is because the game's limited movement options are an intrinsic part of its puzzles. Just look at how much the platforming changes at the part of the game where Madeline gains her second dash. The levels begin to change, to reflect and account for that extra level of flexibility, that extra potential for movement. They present puzzles that would have been literally impossible before having access to that second dash. And that works the other way around too. If you have access to that second dash too early, if you take away the limitations that the levels are designed around, the puzzles just don't work. Charting a course through a level ceases to be a challenge, when hazards are non-existent and movement unrestricted. There is no reason to figure out how to avoid the blobs and nab the dash refresh when a player can just hop along and dash past all the obstacles to the end of the level. Yellow diamonds mean nothing when you have infinite dashes. Avoiding hazards is unnecessary if they pose no threat to the player. And puzzles cease to be puzzles when the limited solution space becomes irrelevant, when every obstacle can be safely ignored or passed on by. It would be like if you took Tetris, a game built around the limitations of a random selection of shapes, and gave the player the option of only playing using long pieces. The problem-solving aspect of the game would vanish. With the constraints gone, there would be no more puzzle left to solve. And this is what removing the movement limitations does to Celeste's puzzles. So there you have it. Celeste Assist mode compromises both sides of its difficulty. Puzzle half and platformer half, A side and B side, both trivialized in one fell swoop. Or, so I would say. Except for the fact that there is still one way for the assist mode to work without sacrificing the puzzle side of the game. Because there is an option in Celeste Assist mode that does nothing to expand Madeline's moveset. Game speed. If game speed were the only option that a player were to change, then the puzzle side of the game would remain intact. Nothing about game speed affects the limited movement options in the game. It is strictly something that makes timing input more forgiving, a factor that only affects the technical execution side of the game. Game speed leaves the player with the same number of jumps, dashes, climbing ability, and vulnerability to hazards, which means the solution space of Celeste's puzzles remains the same limited movement and the same unchanged environment, resulting in the same process of charting and determining the way forward. What you end up with is a platformer that is mostly unconcerned with the technical execution part of the game while leaving the puzzle side intact, where the challenge of precise input is removed in favor of the challenge of simply figuring out the correct path to avoid obstacles and reach the objectives. Which appears to work, at first. But unfortunately, only making use of the game speed modifier still comes with its own set of problems. But before we delve into that, let's take a moment here to zoom out, to leave the scope of Celeste and its assist mode to look at platformers in a more generic sense. Most games hold to a certain corollary, a general trend from which Celeste is not exempt. Games get more difficult as you get closer to the end of the experience. An inane enough observation, to be sure, but an important one. Because for platformers, what more difficulty generally means is leaning less on the puzzle side of the game and more heavily on the technical execution side. These games begin to demand longer sequences of perfect input, with lower tolerances and higher penalties for failure. Less about puzzles and more about raw technical skill. There is still a degree of the puzzle side too, of course. Players will have to figure out exactly how they are going to maneuver their way through the stage. But the sheer amount of instant failure conditions generally makes finding that right path forward extremely obvious. It just makes that path really narrow and uncomfortable. Late game platformer challenges are less about how am I going to do this, and more about how could I possibly do this. Invariably, these late game stages end up looking like spike and pit-ridden hellsicle courses, where executing the path to victory is like threading a line through a path of needles. Which brings us back to Celeste. Back to game speed. Because Celeste does this too. Celeste also gets harder over time, and it gets harder by focusing on technical execution. It leans, as most platformers do, more on the skill component of the game. The right path forward as obvious as a line of blazing neon. What this means is, even players that choose to use a limited version of the assist mode, who only choose to alter the game speed, still find the game trivialized before their eyes. Because although game speed only affects the technical execution side of the game, leaving the puzzle side intact, the game itself becomes less and less about puzzles over time. Less about the part of the game untouched by the assist mode, and more about the part most directly trivialized by it. This results in a situation where using the assist mode, even in the limited scope of only changing game speed, results in an experience that actually gets easier over time. This is why selectively changing game speed doesn't work. Celeste's base structure and progression means that the assist mode ends up crippling difficulty on both fronts, puzzle side and technical execution side. The assist mode disrupts both parts of the difficulty, even when making limited use of the options. But this isn't inevitable. If Celeste maintained a focus on ramping up its puzzle elements as much as it did its technical execution, changing game speed alone would have worked, at least to a degree. And even beyond that, there are other frameworks possible, other kinds of difficulty progression in platformers. What we get in Celeste is just what difficulty looks like when the idea of difficulty is centered around the criteria of stage completion. When platformers are only concerned with the binary condition of passing or failing a level. And there are other metrics available. Let us consider for a moment the mentality of a speedrunner. Speedrunning is all about taking the wide possibility space presented by a game and charting and executing a path in the most efficient, perfect manner possible. Now, let's narrow that down a little further into the bounds of a single level. Time attack, or time trial if you prefer. These levels are also all about reaching the end of the objective, but it's more about time, about how fast you do it. Usually this means less focus on instant death hazards like the Celeste family of platformers, and more focus on stuff that just gets in your way, slows you down, sets you back. Think of a racing game. It's rare or unheard of for an obstacle to outright destroy your vehicle and prevent you from racing. Usually it just adds painful delays to returning to the track. Early levels of Dust Force are great examples of this kind of design in platformers. The game offers safe levels with low amounts of instant death hazards, but a high barrier for executing ever more perfect runs. Simply completing a level is easy enough, but the bar for truly excellent play remains a difficult prospect. Sonic Generations is another platformer focused on this kind of time trial style design. It's all about keeping the player moving. There are hard reset and death conditions to be sure, but they aren't usually there to just outright block your progress to the end of the level. They're there to slow you down. There's a layer of forgiveness and leeway built into the mechanics. Typically, Sonic doesn't die instantly when you hit a spike. What does happen is, you lose all your rings, and, more importantly, you lose all of your momentum, adding big, weighty seconds to your final time. Sonic also doesn't die when you miss an ideal jump. Rather, many times missing jumps doesn't send you to a death and a reset, but instead leads you to a slower alternate path that punishes you with a less ideal time. At the higher ends of the scale, whole swaths of the level are ignored in the pursuit of that one singularly fast route through the level. The game allows for a baseline accessible experience in terms of difficulty, with a high ceiling for those who crave harder, more competitive experiences. And all of this should sound familiar, because time trials are, at the more difficult end of the scale, very similar to the kind of difficulty presented by most platformers, threading a line through a path of needles. Though, with one notable exception. With time trials, if you miss one needle, you aren't forced to start over again. Whereas a traditionally difficult platformer course, like, say, a late game Celeste section, is absolutely riddled with fail states and instant death hazards like spikes and pits, where a single slip up means starting all the way over again. Players can find themselves hitting their head on a wall, perhaps not even able to reach and practice a section of the stage they have difficulty with. But when you make a mistake in a time trial, you aren't forced to constantly start over. You are given a choice. You can try to run the rest of the course, or actually start over. In time trials, even with a wide pool of possible paths to complete a level, functionally, those spikes are still there, for deviating from a perfect planned out path means a worse time. You have the base level stage, but you also have an invisible alternate version of the stage that is absolutely riddled with hazards. Except that if you make a mistake, players are given leeway. There is no instant fail condition. They can choose to keep going instead of starting all over again. All the while working their way towards that same exact ideal path that would have existed if every non-perfect path were riddled with instant fail conditions. The speedrunning mentality means that even in a stage that is ostensibly very forgiving, players make their own spikes. Accessibility is baked into the design itself. Because if difficulty is what is getting in the way of accessibility, then you can simply build accessibility into the core experience. You can shape the design to accommodate both parties. Obviously, this time trial dust force solution isn't something that can simply be applied wholesale. It comes with costs. This kind of design pushes the game towards being about efficiency, about exacting immaculate play that pushes ever closer to perfection. And it simply doesn't make sense to attach this kind of system unless time trial styled efficiency is what you're choosing to make the game about. And that isn't everyone's cup of tea. Even within the relatively limited scope of platformers, there are many games that simply aren't interested in being that kind of experience. Braid is a puzzle platformer that practically embodies the puzzle end of the platformer spectrum. Removing hazards and obstacles in Braid would just destroy the puzzles, and adding on a timer and leaderboard would be kind of missing the point. Likewise, Super Meat Boy is about the struggle of getting to the end of the level. Managing to just barely scrape by after endless failures is half the charm of the game in the first place. You could take Super Meat Boy, cleave away most of the hazards, but that wouldn't be Super Meat Boy anymore. Without the sheer volume of death hazards and tight platforming, you would lose that core feeling of being grinded against a level, dying again and again, before finally reaching that one single glorious success. It would be a completely different experience. A more accessible experience maybe, but a different one nonetheless. And so it is with Celeste. If Celeste turned down the sheer amount of instant death hazards and focused more on efficiency, it would also lose that quality of overcoming a seemingly insurmountable obstacle. It would become a game about something else. More accessible, but also undeniably altered from the base thrust of the game. Because attempting to work accessibility into the core of a game is oftentimes less surgical and more often downright transformative. There is no one size fits all solution, but that doesn't mean it's a lost cause. As the medium develops, so too does our vocabulary of options. We take cues from games that work in accessibility well, and over time we get better and better. Because there are ways of eliminating parts of the difficulty wholesale without eliminating it entirely. There are ways of altering difficulty without sacrificing the core of the experience. Opus Magnum presents many puzzles where solving the simple case of the puzzle is relatively easy, but also presents the additional challenge of optimizing for less parts used, lower cost of materials, and less steps for completion. The game allows for a baseline accessible experience in terms of difficulty, with a high ceiling for those who crave harder, more competitive experiences. And on the other side, there are ways of increasing difficulty without compromising the core experience. Ways of adding and incentivizing more difficulty to make these games more accessible to the other side of players. You can have stuff like Bastion and Transistor, games that allow you to turn on idols and limiters respectively to increase difficulty in selective ways, not just for the challenge, but also increase rewards. Because making a game more accessible doesn't always have to mean watering down the core experience. It doesn't always have to be a kind of sacrifice where both sides are at odds. There are better ways, better options that are discovered over time. So here's a final note, the last bit of takeaway. When accessibility modes go screwy, when they are implemented in a way that cleaves away at the core of the game, all sides are ill served. Because really, everyone wants the same thing. People for whom such modes are a necessity, hardcore difficulty enthusiasts who want ever escalating challenges, and a full spectrum of players in between. They're all the same, just two sides of the same coin. No one wants their experience to be trivial. They just want it to be accessible.